The sound of hooves against hard, packed earth had become such a constant companion to Dalton Hayes that he barely noticed it anymore. But when he pulled his wagon to a stop outside the general store in Cimarron, New Mexico, on that scorching July afternoon in 1876, he heard something else entirely, a soft, desperate gasp coming from beneath the canvas tarp covering his supplies. Dalton froze, his weathered hand still gripping the reins as his heart began to pound. He had been driving for 3 days straight from Santa Fe, transporting goods for the ranchers scattered across the northern territories, and in all that time he had never once suspected he was not alone. The cowboy slowly climbed down from the driver's seat, his boots hitting the dusty street with a heavy thud that sent a small cloud of dirt into the air. The sun beat down mercilessly on his broad shoulders as he moved toward the back of the wagon, his mind racing through possibilities. Bandits. A stowaway thief. His fingers instinctively moved toward the pistol at his hip, but something stopped him. That gasp had not sounded threatening. It had sounded afraid. He pulled back the canvas tarp with one swift motion, flooding the wagon bed with brilliant afternoon light, and found himself staring down at the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She was curled into a tight ball between 2 crates of canned goods, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around her dirt-smudged face, and her green eyes were wide with terror as she looked up at him. Her dress was torn at the hem and covered in dust, and she was shaking despite the oppressive heat. For a moment, neither of them moved. Dalton stood there with the tarp in his hand, taking in the sight of this frightened creature who had somehow managed to hide herself in his wagon without his knowledge. And she stared back at him with an expression that was equal parts fear and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the busy street behind him. "Please do not turn me in." Dalton felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct he had not experienced since his younger sister had died of fever 5 years ago. He glanced over his shoulder at the street, where townspeople were going about their business, none of them paying any attention to the cowboy and his wagon. When he looked back at the woman, he saw tears beginning to stream down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the dust on her face. "Who are you running from?" he asked, his voice low and steady. He did not move to grab her or call for help, and he saw the surprise flicker across her features at his calm tone. "My stepfather," she said, and the word came out like a curse. "He sold me to a man in Santa Fe. I was supposed to marry him in 2 days, but I ran. I hid in your wagon when you stopped at the trading post outside the city. I am so sorry. I had nowhere else to go." Dalton looked at her for a long moment, noting the bruises on her wrists that she tried to hide beneath her sleeves, the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of weeks or months of fear. He had heard stories like this before. The territories were full of desperate men who saw women as property to be bought and sold, and the law rarely interfered in what they called family matters. Something hot and angry flared in his gut at the thought of this woman being forced into marriage against her will. "What is your name?" he asked. "Grace," she said. "Grace Gardner." "Well, Grace Gardner," Dalton said, making a decision that he knew would complicate his life considerably but which felt more right than anything he had done in years. "You can stop hiding now. If you need a place to stay, I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here. It is not much, but it is mine, and no one will take you from there against your will." Grace stared at him as though he had just spoken a foreign language. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to find words. "You are not angry. You are not going to turn me over to the sheriff." "I figure a woman desperate enough to hide in a stranger's wagon for 3 days probably has a good reason," Dalton said. He extended his hand toward her. Come on out of there before someone sees you and starts asking questions." She hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Her fingers were small and cold despite the heat, and he felt her trembling as he helped her climb out of the wagon bed. She stumbled when her feet hit the ground, her legs clearly stiff from being cramped in such a small space for so long, and Dalton steadied her with a hand on her elbow. Up close, he could see that she was probably around 22 or 23 years old, with delicate features and a bearing that suggested she had come from a respectable family before whatever circumstances had led her to this desperate flight. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so," Grace said, though her voice was uncertain. "My legs are just asleep." "I need to pick up a few supplies in the store," Dalton said, thinking quickly. "Then we will head to the ranch. Do you have any belongings?" Grace shook her head. "Just what I am wearing." Dalton nodded and guided her toward the front of the wagon, helping her up onto the driver's seat. "Stay here. If anyone asks, you are my cousin from back east. Can you remember that?" "Yes," Grace said, and for the first time a small, tentative smile crossed her face. "Thank you. I do not know why you are being kind to me, but thank you." Dalton tipped his hat to her and turned toward the general store, his mind already working through the logistics of what he had just committed himself to. He had been living alone on his ranch for 3 years now, ever since his father had died and left him the property. It was a modest spread, just enough cattle to make a living and a small house that he had built with his own hands, but it was honest work and it was his. Taking in a runaway woman was going to raise eyebrows in town, but Dalton had never been one to care much about what others thought. He had seen too much cruelty in his 30 years to stand by and let it happen when he had the power to prevent it. Inside the store, he purchased flour, sugar, coffee, and a few other necessities, along with a simple calico dress and a pair of sturdy boots that he hoped would fit Grace. The storekeeper, a gray-haired man named Morton, gave him a curious look when he added the women's items to his order. "Got yourself a lady friend, Hayes?" Morton asked with a knowing grin. "My cousin is visiting from Kansas City," Dalton said smoothly. "Her luggage got lost on the train." Morton nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation, and wrapped the items in brown paper. Dalton paid and carried his purchases back to the wagon, where Grace was sitting exactly as he had left her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He loaded the supplies into the back and then climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his hands. "Let us get out of town before we do any more talking," he said quietly, and she nodded. The ride north was quiet at first. Grace seemed afraid to speak, as though she still could not quite believe that this stranger was actually helping her rather than turning her over to the authorities. Dalton focused on driving, guiding the horses along the dusty road that led away from Cimarron and into the open countryside. The landscape here was beautiful in its harsh way, all red rocks and scrubby vegetation dotted with juniper and pinon pine. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in the heat of summer. After about half an hour, when the town had disappeared behind them and there was nothing but empty land in all directions, Dalton finally spoke. "Tell me about your stepfather," he said. "How long have you been running?" Grace was silent for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "My mother married him 4 years ago after my father died. At first he seemed kind enough, but after the wedding, everything changed. He spent all of my mother's money on gambling and drink. When she died last winter, he decided I should marry his friend, a horrible man who already has 2 wives buried in the cemetery. I heard them talking about the price. $300. That is what I was worth to him." Dalton felt his jaw tighten. "And you ran?" "I waited until the night before the wedding," Grace said. I took what little money I had hidden away and I ran. I made it to Santa Fe, but I knew they would look for me there. When I saw your wagon at the trading post, I just climbed in. I did not think beyond that moment. I just knew I had to get away. You have been in there for 3 days without food or water, Dalton asked, alarm creeping into his voice. I had a canteen and some bread I had stolen, Grace admitted. But yes, it ran out yesterday. I thought I might die in that wagon, but it seemed better than the alternative. Dalton shook his head in amazement. You are tougher than you look, Grace Gardner. She gave him a sideways glance, and he saw the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I suppose desperation makes people capable of things they never imagined. They rode in comfortable silence for the rest of the journey. Dalton pointed out landmarks along the way, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a creek that ran year-round where he sometimes fished, the boundary marker that indicated where his property began. Grace listened intently, and he could see her beginning to relax, the tension slowly leaving her shoulders as they put more distance between her and whatever life she was fleeing. The ranch came into view as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was not much to look at: a single-story house built of adobe and wood, a barn that needed a fresh coat of paint, and a corral where a few horses stood in the shade. But to Dalton, it represented everything he had worked for, and he felt a small surge of pride as he drove the wagon up to the house. "This is it," he said, bringing the horses to a stop. "Home." Grace climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help this time, and he saw her looking around with wide eyes. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Dalton laughed. "It is rough country and the house is not much, but it is mine. Come on, I will show you inside." The interior of the house was simple but clean. There was a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall and a sturdy wooden table with 4 chairs. 2 smaller rooms branched off from the main space. One was Dalton's bedroom, and the other had been his father's before he died. It still contained a bed and a dresser, though the room had been closed up for years. "You can have this room," Dalton said, opening the door and letting light flood into the dusty space. "I will air it out and get you some fresh linens. It is not fancy, but the bed is comfortable." Grace walked into the room slowly, running her hand along the dresser top and leaving a trail in the dust. When she turned back to face him, there were tears streaming down her face again. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You do not know me. I could be lying to you. I could be a thief or worse. Why are you helping me?" Dalton leaned against the door frame and considered his answer carefully. "My sister was about your age when she died," he said finally. "Before that, there was a man who wanted to marry her. My father said no because he could see the man was no good, but the fellow kept coming around, getting more aggressive. One night he tried to drag her out of the house. I stopped him, but it made me realize how vulnerable women are out here. No one should be forced into a life they do not want. If I can help you avoid that, then I will." Grace wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I will work," she said firmly. "I will earn my keep. I can cook and clean and tend animals. I will not be a burden to you." "We will figure it out," Dalton said. "For now, you need rest and food." "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" "I cannot remember," Grace admitted. Dalton nodded and moved back into the main room, beginning to build a fire in the stove. "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage beans and cornbread. Why do not you get cleaned up? There is a pump out back for water, and I bought you a new dress in town. It is in the package on the table." Grace looked at the brown paper parcel as though it contained treasure. She picked it up carefully, holding it against her chest. "You bought me a dress." "And boots," Dalton said. not looking at her as he busied himself with the fire. "I figured you would need them. This is rough country." He heard her leave the room, and a few minutes later he heard the sound of the pump working outside. While she was gone, he got the fire going and started heating water for beans, then went about opening windows and shaking out the dusty linens from her room. By the time Grace returned, wearing the new blue calico dress with her damp hair hanging loose around her shoulders, he had a simple meal laid out on the table. She looked transformed. The dress fit her well, showing off her slender figure, and with the dirt washed from her face, he could see that she was even more beautiful than he had initially thought. Her green eyes were bright and clear, and there was a hint of color in her cheeks that had not been there before. Dalton found himself staring and had to force himself to look away. "Sit down and eat," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You must be starving." They ate in silence at first, and Dalton noticed that Grace ate slowly, as though she was afraid the food might disappear if she moved too quickly. He filled her plate twice, pleased to see that she had an appetite despite everything she had been through. When they were finished, she insisted on washing the dishes while he went out to tend to the horses and check on the cattle. The sun had fully set by the time he came back inside, and he found Grace sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She had braided her hair, and in the firelight she looked peaceful in a way that he suspected she had not felt in a long time. "Thank you for dinner," she said without looking at him, "and for everything else. I know I have said it before, but I truly mean it. You have saved my life." Dalton settled into the chair across from her. "You do not have to keep thanking me, Grace. I did what anyone decent would do." "But most people would not have done it," she said, turning to look at him. "Most people would have turned me over to the sheriff or demanded something in return for their help. You have asked for nothing." "I do not want anything except to see you safe," Dalton said. "Now we should talk about practical matters. Your stepfather and this man he sold you to, are they likely to come looking for you?" Grace's expression darkened. "I do not know. My stepfather is lazy and drinks too much. He might decide I am not worth the effort. But the other man, Victor Blackstone, he is different. He is wealthy and he is used to getting what he wants. If he has paid for me, he might come looking." "Then we need to be careful," Dalton said. "Cimarron is a small town and people talk. Eventually, someone might mention seeing me with a woman. If he comes asking questions, I want to be prepared." "What will we tell people?" Grace asked. "You told the storekeeper I was your cousin, but that lie will not hold up for long." Dalton had been thinking about this very problem during his chores. "We could tell people the truth, or a version of it. You are a woman who was fleeing a bad situation, and I offered you work on my ranch. It is not uncommon for ranchers to hire help." "But I am a woman," Grace pointed out. "People will talk regardless." "Let them talk," Dalton said with a shrug. "I have never much cared for gossip. As long as you are safe, that is all that matters." Grace smiled at him, and it was a real smile this time, warm and genuine. "You are a good man, Dalton Hayes. I hope you know that." He felt his face grow warm and looked away. "I am just a man trying to do right, that is all." They talked for a while longer about mundane things, the layout of the ranch, the work that needed to be done, the rhythms of daily life in this remote corner of New Mexico. Eventually, Grace began to yawn, and Dalton sent her off to bed, insisting that she needed rest more than anything else. After she had closed the door to her room, Dalton sat by the fire for a long time, thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. This morning, he had been a solitary cowboy, content with his simple existence. Now he was responsible for the safety and well-being of a woman he barely knew, a woman who was being hunted by men who saw her as property. It should have felt like a burden, but instead, Dalton felt energized in a way he had not experienced in years. For the first time since his father's death, his house felt less empty. The days that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Grace proved to be as good as her word, throwing herself into the work of the ranch with an enthusiasm that surprised Dalton. She cooked meals that were far better than anything he had managed on his own. She kept the house clean and organized, and she even helped with the animals, showing no fear of the horses or the chickens, or even the ornery bull that Dalton had been meaning to sell for months. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Grace told him about her childhood, about growing up in St. Louis with parents who had loved her and encouraged her education. She had been able to read and write and do sums, skills that were not common among women in the territories, and Dalton found himself fascinated by her intelligence and her curiosity about the world. She asked him endless questions about ranching and cattle and the land itself, and he discovered that he enjoyed teaching her, watching her face light up when she understood something new. For his part, Dalton shared stories about his own upbringing, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the dreams he had of expanding his ranch someday. He told her about his sister, about how her death had left a hole in his heart that he had never quite figured out how to fill. And Grace listened with a compassion that made him feel less alone than he had in years. 2 weeks after Grace's arrival, Dalton had to make another trip into Cimarron for supplies. Grace begged to come along, saying she was going stir-crazy at the ranch, and after some consideration, Dalton agreed. They made the trip in the early morning, when the air was still cool and the light was soft and golden. In town, they went about their business efficiently. Dalton introduced Grace to Morton at the general store, explaining that she was helping out at his ranch, and the older man accepted this without much comment, though Dalton saw the curiosity in his eyes. They were just loading the last of their purchases into the wagon when a stranger approached them. He was a tall man with slicked-back dark hair and expensive clothes that looked out of place in the dusty western town. His eyes were cold and calculating, and when they landed on Grace, she went rigid beside Dalton. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "Grace Gardner, I have been looking for you." Dalton stepped slightly in front of Grace, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. "And who might you be?" "Victor Blackstone," the man said, his eyes never leaving Grace. "This woman is my betrothed. She ran away from her responsibilities, and I have come to collect what is mine." "I am not your anything," Grace said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I never agreed to marry you. My stepfather sold me against my will." "Your stepfather is your legal guardian," Blackstone said coldly. "He had every right to arrange your marriage. Now stop this foolishness and come with me." "She is not going anywhere with you," Dalton said flatly. "The lady has made her wishes clear." Blackstone finally looked at Dalton, his expression turning dangerous. "And who are you to interfere in my business, cowboy?" "I am the man telling you to leave," Dalton said. "Grace has a place at my ranch, and she will stay there as long as she chooses. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the sheriff." "The sheriff?" Blackstone laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The sheriff will side with me. I have the legal right to this woman. Her stepfather signed a contract." "A contract to sell a human being," Dalton said, his voice hard. "That does not sit right with me, and I suspect it will not sit right with a lot of folks around here once they hear about it." A crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Dalton saw Morton standing in the doorway of his store, and several other townspeople had stopped to watch. Blackstone seemed to realize that he had lost the element of surprise, and his expression turned calculating. "This is not over," he said, looking between Dalton and Grace. I will be back with the proper authorities, and we will see who has the legal right here." He turned and walked away, and Dalton watched him go, his heart pounding. Grace was trembling beside him, and he put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We need to go," he said quietly. "Now." They climbed into the wagon and started back toward the ranch, driving faster than was probably safe. Grace was silent for the entire journey, her hands clenched in her lap, and Dalton could see the fear returning to her eyes. When they finally reached the ranch, she climbed down from the wagon and walked straight into the house without a word. Dalton took care of the horses and unloaded the supplies, giving her time to collect herself. When he finally went inside, he found her sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands. He sat down across from her and waited. "He found me," she said finally, her voice muffled. "I thought I was safe, but he found me." "He found you, but he did not take you," Dalton pointed out. "And he will not take you. I meant what I said, Grace. You are under my protection now." She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "But he is right about the law. My stepfather did sign a contract. In the eyes of the law, I belong to Victor Blackstone." "The law is not always just," Dalton said. "And I do not much care what some piece of paper says. You are a person, not property, and you have the right to decide your own future." "But what can we do?" Grace asked desperately. "If he comes back with the sheriff, they will force me to go with him." Dalton was quiet for a moment, thinking through their options. An idea was forming in his mind, something that would solve their problem but which would change both of their lives irrevocably. He was not sure if it was wise, but he could not see another way forward. "We could get married," he said finally, the words hanging in the air between them. Grace stared at him as though he had lost his mind. "What? If we get married, then you are my wife, not his betrothed," Dalton explained. "A marriage contract would supersede any agreement your stepfather made. You would be legally protected." "But that is crazy," Grace said, shaking her head. "We barely know each other. You cannot just marry me to save me from Victor Blackstone." "Why not?" Dalton asked. "People get married for all sorts of reasons out here: companionship, convenience, survival. This would not be so different." "But marriage is supposed to be about love," Grace said, her voice small. "Maybe it grows into that," Dalton said gently. "Or maybe it does not. But either way, you would be safe, and that is what matters most right now." Grace was silent for a long time, clearly wrestling with the decision. Dalton watched her, trying to ignore the way his heart was racing. The truth was that over the past 2 weeks, he had come to care for Grace more than he wanted to admit. She had brought life back to his lonely ranch, had filled his empty house with laughter and warmth. The thought of her being dragged away by Victor Blackstone made him feel violent in a way he had not experienced since his sister's death. If marrying her was what it took to keep her safe, then he would do it without hesitation. "You would do that for me?" Grace asked finally, looking up at him with those incredible green eyes. "You would marry a woman you barely know, tie yourself to her for life just to protect her?" "Yes," Dalton said simply. "I would." Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked like tears of relief rather than fear. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Dalton Hayes, and I promise I will do everything I can to be a good wife to you." They were married the next day by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the area. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them and the preacher standing in the main room of the ranch house. But when Dalton slipped a simple gold band onto Grace's finger, something shifted between them. This was no longer just about protection or convenience. This was real. That night, they sat up late talking about what their marriage would mean. Dalton made it clear that he had no expectations of Grace beyond companionship, that she could have her own room, and they would simply present themselves as man and wife to the outside world. But Grace surprised him by saying that she wanted their marriage to be real in every sense of the word. "You have been nothing but kind to me," she said, her cheeks flushing pink in the firelight. "You have given me safety and a home and now your name. I do not want this to be just for show. I want to be your wife, truly." Dalton felt something warm bloom in his chest. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel obligated." "I am sure," Grace said, and when she looked at him, he saw something new in her eyes, a warmth that made his breath catch. "I know we started this arrangement out of necessity, but these past 2 weeks have been the happiest I have been since my mother died. You make me feel safe, Dalton. You make me feel valued. That is worth more than any grand romance." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Then we will make this work," he said. "We will build a life together, you and me." That night, Grace moved her belongings into his room and they lay together in the darkness, talking in whispers about their hopes and fears. When Dalton finally kissed her, it was gentle and sweet, and he felt her melt against him with a sigh that told him she had been waiting for this as much as he had. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Marriage to Grace was nothing like Dalton had imagined it might be. She was funny and clever, with a sharp wit that kept him on his toes. She was also affectionate in a way that surprised him, always finding reasons to touch him, a hand on his arm as she passed by, a kiss on his cheek when he came in from working with the cattle. Her body curled against his at night as they slept. He found himself looking forward to the end of each workday, when he could return to the house and find her there waiting for him. They fell into an easy rhythm of shared labor and shared leisure. During the day, they worked side by side, mending fences and tending the animals and doing all the countless tasks that came with running a ranch. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, and Grace would read to him from books she had brought from her old life, stories of far-off places and adventures that fired his imagination. And at night, they would hold each other close, and Dalton would thank whatever providence had led Grace to hide in his wagon that day in Santa Fe. It was not always easy. There were hard days when the work seemed endless and the heat was oppressive. There were moments when Grace would grow quiet and withdrawn, clearly thinking about the life she had left behind, and Dalton would have to coax her back to the present with gentle words and patient understanding. And there was always the lingering worry that Victor Blackstone might return, though as the weeks turned into months with no sign of him, they began to relax their guard. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Grace turned to Dalton with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something," she said. Dalton felt a flicker of worry. "What is it?" "I am with child," Grace said simply, and then she waited, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Dalton felt as though all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. A baby. He was going to be a father. The idea was both terrifying and wonderful, and he found himself grinning like a fool. "Are you sure?" he asked. Grace nodded. "I have suspected for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. I know this changes things. We have only been married for 3 months, and now there will be a child to care for." Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "This does not change anything except to make me happier than I have ever been," he said fiercely. "A baby, Grace, our baby. How could that be anything but wonderful?" She relaxed against him, and he felt her shoulders shake with quiet sobs. "I was so afraid you would be angry," she admitted. "I know this happened so fast." "I could never be angry about this," Dalton said, pulling back to look at her face. "You have given me everything, Grace. A reason to come home at the end of the day, a purpose beyond just surviving, and now a child. I cannot imagine anything better." Over the following months, they prepared for the arrival of their baby. Dalton built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it until it was soft as silk so that no splinter would harm their child. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her face glowing with contentment as she worked. They talked endlessly about names and what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the values they would teach and the life they would build for their child. The baby came in May, on a warm spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Dalton feared he might lose Grace, but she was strong and determined, and when their son finally entered the world with a loud, healthy cry, Dalton felt tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Grace whispered, cradling the baby against her chest. "Look at him, Dalton. He is perfect." Dalton looked down at his son, at the tiny fingers, and the shock of dark hair and the eyes that seemed to look right into his soul, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" "What about Daniel?" Grace suggested. "After your father." "Daniel Hayes," Dalton said, testing the name. "I like it. Daniel it is." Being a father changed Dalton in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself working harder than ever, driven by the need to provide for his growing family. But he also found himself taking more time to simply be present, to hold his son and marvel at the way he was growing and changing every single day. Grace was a natural mother, patient and loving, and watching her with Daniel made Dalton fall in love with her all over again. When Daniel was 6 months old, they received a letter from Santa Fe. It was from an attorney, informing them that Grace's stepfather had died of liver failure and that Victor Blackstone had died in a shooting in a gambling dispute. The contracts and claims against Grace were no longer valid. She was free. Grace read the letter twice before setting it down with shaking hands. "They are gone," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Both of them. I am truly free." "You have been free since the day you became my wife," Dalton reminded her, but he understood what she meant. The shadow that had hung over them, the fear that someone might come to take her away, was finally gone. They could live their lives without looking over their shoulders. That night, they celebrated quietly, toasting with glasses of wine that Dalton had been saving for a special occasion. Grace seemed lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and she smiled more freely than he had ever seen. "I never thought I would be this happy," she said as they sat together watching Daniel sleep in his cradle. "When I climbed into your wagon that day, I was just trying to survive. I never imagined I would find love." "I love you too," Dalton said, the words coming easily now. They had said them to each other many times over the past months, but they never stopped feeling important. "I loved you the moment I saw you hiding in my wagon, even though I did not know it yet." Grace laughed softly. "You did not love me then. You felt sorry for me." "Maybe," Dalton admitted. "But somewhere between that moment and now, pity turned into respect and respect turned into love. And now I cannot imagine my life without you." The years that followed were filled with hard work and simple joys. The ranch prospered, allowing them to expand their herd and improve their property. Daniel grew into a curious, energetic toddler who followed his father everywhere, always asking questions and getting into mischief. When he was 3, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Lily, and 2 years after that, another son they called James. Dalton had never imagined he would have such a full house, and there were days when the noise and chaos felt overwhelming, but he would not have traded it for anything. His children adored him, and he adored them right back. He taught Daniel and James to ride and rope, passing down the skills his own father had taught him. He showed Lily how to care for the chickens and the garden, and watched with pride as she proved to be just as capable as her brothers at everything she attempted. Through it all, Grace was his constant companion and partner. She managed the household with efficient grace, but she also remained involved in the ranch work, often riding out with Dalton to check on the cattle or mend fences. They had grown together, their initial arrangement of convenience blossoming into a love that was deep and enduring. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Grace on a picnic to the place where they had first seen his ranch together, that day when he had brought her home from Cimarron. The children were spending the day with a neighboring family, giving them rare time alone together. "You remember that day?" Dalton asked as they sat on a blanket, looking out over the land they had built their life on. "When I brought you here for the first time?" "I remember thinking it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen," Grace said, leaning against his shoulder. "I remember feeling safe for the first time in months. And I remember looking at you and thinking that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right." "I remember seeing you in my wagon," Dalton said. "Scared and dirty and so desperate. I remember thinking that I had to help you, that I could not live with myself if I did not. I never expected to fall in love with you. I never expected any of this." Grace turned to look at him, her green eyes still as bright and beautiful as they had been that first day. "Are you happy? Truly happy?" "I am happier than I ever thought possible," Dalton said honestly. "You gave me a family, Grace. You gave me love. You gave me purpose." "What more could any man want? I am glad," Grace said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "Because you gave me all of those things too. You gave me freedom and safety and a home. You gave me children and a life worth living. I was so lost when I climbed into your wagon that day, Dalton. And you found me. You saved me." "We saved each other," Dalton corrected, kissing her gently. "And we built something beautiful together." As they sat there watching the sun set over their land, Dalton thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. A decade ago, he had been alone, content but not truly happy. Now he had a wife he loved more than anything, 3 healthy children, and a thriving ranch. All because he had chosen compassion over anger when he found a frightened woman hiding in his wagon. The children grew and flourished. Daniel proved to have a gift for working with horses, and by the time he was 16, people were coming from all over the territory to have him train their animals. Lily inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's work ethic, and she announced at age 14 that she wanted to become a teacher, a dream that both Dalton and Grace supported wholeheartedly. James was the wild one, always getting into scrapes and adventures, but he had a good heart and a fierce loyalty to his family that made his parents proud. Through it all, Dalton and Grace's love only deepened. They had their disagreements. Of course, no marriage was perfect, but they had learned how to communicate, how to forgive, how to support each other through the hard times. When drought struck and they lost half their herd, they worked together to rebuild. When Grace's health faltered one winter and she was bedridden for weeks with pneumonia, Dalton nursed her back to health with the same dedication she had always shown their family. They were partners in every sense of the word, and their children grew up watching what real love looked like. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, their children threw them a party. Friends and neighbors from all over the area came to celebrate, filling the ranch house and spilling out onto the porch and yard. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Daniel gave a toast that made Grace cry, talking about how his parents had shown him what it meant to truly love someone. Lily presented them with a leather-bound book she had made, filled with stories and memories from their 2 decades together. Even James, who was not usually sentimental, gave them a hug and told them they were the best parents anyone could ask for. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Dalton and Grace sat on the porch swing they had installed years ago, wrapped in a blanket against the cool night air. 20 years, Grace said softly. "It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Dalton said, his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes I still feel like that young cowboy who found a woman hiding in his wagon. Other times, I cannot remember what life was like before you." "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Marrying me on such short notice? Taking on so much responsibility?" Dalton turned to look at her, cupping her face in his hand. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Hayes. You and our children. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Grace smiled, that same beautiful smile that had captured his heart all those years ago. "Good," she said, "because I would not change anything either. Well, maybe I would have been a little less dirty when you first saw me. I must have looked like a wild thing." Dalton laughed. "You looked like someone who needed help, and I am glad I was there to give it." They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently on the swing and looking up at the stars scattered across the vast New Mexico sky. Dalton thought about all the twists and turns that had led them to this moment, all the choices and chances that had brought them together. It was easy to believe in fate when he looked at how perfectly their lives had intertwined. "Tell me something," Grace said after a while. "When did you know you loved me? Not when you realized it, but when did you actually fall in love?" Dalton considered the question carefully. "I think it was about a week after you came to the ranch," he said finally. "I came in from working with the cattle, tired and dirty and ready to just fall into bed. But you had made this wonderful dinner, and you insisted I sit down and eat before I did anything else. And while I ate, you told me about the book you had been reading, and your eyes were so bright and your voice was so animated, and I remember thinking that I never wanted to come home to an empty house again. That was when I knew." "That early?" Grace said, sounding surprised. "That early," Dalton confirmed. "What about you?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "I think it was the day we got married," she said. "When you put that ring on my finger and made those vows, even though we barely knew each other. I looked into your eyes and saw that you meant every word, that you were committing yourself to me completely. And I thought that this was what real love must look like. Not the fairy tale kind, but the kind that shows up and does the hard thing because it is the right thing. That was when I fell in love with you." Dalton pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We have had a good life together," he said. "The best life," Grace agreed. "And we still have so much more ahead of us, watching our children grow and have families of their own. Growing old together. I cannot wait to see what comes next." "Neither can I," Dalton said, and he meant it. They continued to sit there on the porch swing, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars wheel overhead. Inside the house, their children were probably already asleep in their rooms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but for now, everything was perfect. Dalton thought about that desperate, frightened woman who had hidden in his wagon 20 years ago, and the young cowboy who had chosen compassion over anger. Neither of them could have imagined how that single decision would change their lives forever. As Grace's breathing deepened, and she dozed against his shoulder, Dalton smiled into the darkness. He had set out that morning 2 decades ago, expecting nothing more than another routine supply run. Instead, he had found his future, his partner, the love of his life, and every day since then had been a gift. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. Daniel married a sweet young woman from a neighboring ranch and started his own horse training business nearby. Lily went away to school in Denver and became a teacher, just as she had dreamed, though she returned to New Mexico every summer to visit. James took over more and more of the ranch work as Dalton began to slow down with age, proving himself to be a capable and dedicated rancher. And through it all, Dalton and Grace remained each other's constant. They were partners in every sense, in work, in parenting, in facing whatever challenges life threw at them. Their love, which had begun in such unusual circumstances, had grown into something rare and precious, the kind of bond that only comes from truly knowing and accepting another person completely. On their 30th anniversary, Dalton took Grace back to Cimarron, to the spot where they had encountered Victor Blackstone all those years ago. The town had grown and changed, but the general store was still there, now run by Morton's son. "Why did you bring me here?" Grace asked as they stood on the street. "Because this is where I realized how much you meant to me," Dalton said. "When Blackstone tried to take you, I knew I would do anything to keep you safe. That was when I understood that you were not just someone I was helping, you were someone I could not live without." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Even after all these years, he could still make her cry with his words. "You have made me so happy, Dalton. Happier than I ever thought possible when I was running from that awful life. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Dalton corrected. "That is what love is, Grace. It is not about one person saving another. It is about two people choosing to build a life together, every single day." They walked through Cimarron hand in hand, visiting the places that held memories for them. The church where the traveling preacher had married them was still there, though it had been expanded and improved. The road leading north to their ranch was now well traveled, no longer the dusty track it had been when Dalton first brought Grace home. Everything had changed, and yet the essential truth of their love remained the same. When they returned to the ranch that evening, they found their entire family gathered there, Daniel and his wife with their 2 young children, Lily home from Denver for the occasion, and James with a young woman he had been courting. There was a huge meal spread out on tables in the yard, and neighbors had come from miles around to celebrate. As the sun began to set and the party wound down, Dalton stood up to say a few words. He was not much for speeches, but he wanted his family to understand what these 30 years had meant to him. "Most of you know the story of how Grace and I met," he began, looking around at the gathered faces. "How she hid in my wagon and I found her and brought her home. It would be easy to tell that story like I was some kind of hero, but the truth is, Grace is the one who was brave. She took a chance on a stranger. She built a life in a harsh land. She raised our children and helped me build this ranch into something we can all be proud of." He turned to Grace, who was wiping tears from her eyes. "You made me a better man," he told her. "Every single day for the past 30 years, you have made me want to be worthy of your love, and I hope I have succeeded, even just a little bit." Grace stood and came to his side, taking his hand. "You succeeded more than you know," she said softly. "You gave a lost, frightened girl a home. You gave a desperate woman hope. You gave me a love that has sustained me through everything life has thrown at us. I could not have asked for a better partner, a better husband, a better father to my children." They embraced while their family and friends applauded, and Dalton felt a sense of profound gratitude wash over him. His life had not been easy, ranching never was, but it had been good. It had been filled with love and purpose and meaning, and it had all started with a single moment of compassion, a choice to help rather than to judge. As the evening grew darker and the guests began to leave, Dalton and Grace found themselves alone once more on their porch swing, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of the day, and neither of them could imagine life without it. "You think about how different things could have been?" Grace asked quietly. "If you had turned me in that day, if you had been angry instead of kind." "Sometimes," Dalton admitted, "but not in a sad way, more in a grateful way. I am grateful that I made the choice I did. I am grateful that you had the courage to hide in my wagon. I am grateful for every moment we have had together." "I am grateful too," Grace said, "for all of it. Even the hard parts. Because they brought us here to this moment with a family we love and a life we built together." They sat in silence for a while longer, comfortable in each other's presence the way only two people who have shared decades of life together can be. Dalton thought about all the adventures they had shared, all the trials they had overcome, all the joy they had experienced. And he thought about all the time they still had ahead of them, all the grandchildren they would watch grow, all the quiet evenings they would spend together on this porch. "I love you, Grace Hayes," he said into the darkness. "I love you too, Dalton Hayes," she replied, "forever and always." And as they sat there under the vast New Mexico sky, surrounded by the land they had worked and loved for so many years, Dalton knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man alive. He had found his home not in a place, but in a person, and that made all the difference. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management, with Dalton offering advice and guidance but mostly enjoying the slower pace of his later years. He and Grace spent their days working in the garden, taking long walks across their property, and spoiling their growing number of grandchildren. Daniel and his wife had given them 3 grandchildren in total, and Lily had recently written to say that she was expecting her first child with the schoolteacher she had married. On a warm summer evening when Dalton was 65 and Grace was 60, they sat on their porch swing for what must have been the 1,000th time, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Grace's hair was now completely gray, and Dalton's hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been when they first met. "You know what I realized today," Grace said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "What is that?" Dalton asked, his arm automatically going around her. "It has been 40 years since the day I climbed into your wagon," she said. 40 years since you found me and changed my life forever." Dalton did the math in his head and realized she was right. 4 decades had passed since that fateful day in Santa Fe. It seemed impossible, and yet when he looked at everything they had built together, the thriving ranch, their 3 grown children, their grandchildren, the deep and abiding love they shared, he could see the passage of time written in every blessing. 40 years, he repeated softly. "It went by so fast, and so slowly," Grace said with a small laugh. "Some days felt like they would never end, but looking back now, it all seems to have happened in the blink of an eye. Do you have any regrets?" Dalton asked, a question he had asked her many times over the years but never tired of hearing the answer to. "Not a single one," Grace said firmly. "Well, maybe I regret not learning to bake better bread. Yours always turns out better than mine." Dalton chuckled. "That is because I learned from my mother, who learned from her mother. It is the Hayes family secret. A secret you still have not shared with your wife of 37 years, Grace teased. "Some secrets must be kept," Dalton said solemnly, though his eyes were twinkling with humor. They fell into comfortable silence again, and Dalton found his mind drifting back over the years. He thought about the births of each of their children, the terror and joy mixed together. He thought about the year they almost lost the ranch to a particularly bad drought, and how they had pulled through by sheer determination and the help of good neighbors. He thought about the day Grace's first poem was published in a Denver newspaper, and how proud he had been of her talent. He thought about teaching his sons to rope and his daughter to ride, about the countless meals shared around their kitchen table, about the laughter and tears and everything in between. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, as though she could sense his nostalgic mood. Everything, Dalton said. All of it, our whole life together. It has been a good life, Grace said softly. The best, Dalton agreed. Better than I ever could have imagined. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dalton pulled Grace closer. They had faced everything together: hardship and plenty, sorrow and joy, sickness and health. They had kept the promises they made to each other on that simple day when a traveling preacher married them in their ranch house. They had built something lasting, something real, something beautiful. "Thank you," Grace whispered. "For what?" Dalton asked. "For seeing me that day," she said. "Not just with your eyes, but with your heart. For seeing past the dirt and the fear to the person underneath. For giving me a chance at happiness when I thought all hope was lost." "Thank you for taking that chance," Dalton replied. "For trusting me when you had no reason to. For building this life with me. For loving me even when I was difficult or stubborn or too focused on the ranch." "You were never too difficult," Grace said with a smile in her voice. "Well, maybe sometimes, but you were always worth it." They sat together until the sky was fully dark and the air had grown cool. Inside the house, they could hear James and his now wife moving around, preparing for bed. Their home was still full of life and love, just in a different way than it had been when the children were young. Eventually, they would probably move into the smaller house that James was planning to build on the property, letting the younger generation have the main house. But that was a decision for another day. For now, Dalton was content to sit with his wife, the woman who had hidden in his wagon 40 years ago and changed his life forever. The woman who had given him children and grandchildren, who had stood by his side through every challenge, who had loved him faithfully and completely for nearly 4 decades. The woman who was, quite simply, the best thing that had ever happened to him. As they finally stood to go inside for the night, Dalton took one last look at the stars scattered across the sky. He thought about that young cowboy he had been, driving his wagon through the territories, thinking he was content with his solitary life. He had not known that he was lonely until Grace had filled that loneliness. He had not understood what he was missing until she had given it to him. "Ready for bed?" Grace asked, taking his hand. "Ready for anything as long as you are with me," Dalton said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. They walked into the house together, hands still clasped, just as they had done thousands of times before and would do thousands of times more. And as Dalton closed the door behind them, shutting out the night, he felt a profound sense of peace. His life had been simple but rich, hard but rewarding. And at the center of it all had been love, the kind of love that starts with compassion, grows through shared experience, and deepens into something eternal. He had found a woman hiding in his wagon, frightened and desperate. Instead of anger, he had offered her a home. And in return, she had given him everything that truly mattered. It was, he thought as he followed her into their bedroom, the best trade any man had ever made.